What I would advocate is that every single one of those boat arrivals is deported and sent somewhere like Rwanda.
Surely the primary moral duty of a government is to its own citizens before it starts helping people from Afghanistan or
of course,
Eritrea.
Absolutely. Again,
and we have our own poverty to deal with.
I'd like to see more than net zero immigration. I'd like to see some net negative immigration for a while. I think when you look at what happened during the Boris Johnson era, that was way out of control. Multiculturalism is a mistake. We should have one homogenising British culture open to people of all faiths and all colours. I don't think any kind of test can be applied to a human being to work out, do you fit or do you not?
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. So the country is still reeling from the latest violent crime which took place on a train from Peterborough to London. It feels, at least, like they happen more than ever. There's also now this rather sinister ritual where the social media groups all gather into their gangs and start hoping or fearing that the identity of the suspect will fit into one of their preconceived narratives. It really feels like this question of the levels of violent crime and where it's coming from is one of the key political questions of the day. Well, one very senior journalist who is taking a very unique tack on this issue is Fraser Nelson. He is a columnist at The Times, former editor of The Spectator, and he joins us in the studio to talk through the stats, the data, and let's basically take the time to have it out on what is the level of violent crime? Is it really going up? And who do we think that trend is coming from? Fraser, welcome to UnHerd.
Great to be here.
So you published a piece which just lays out a whole bunch of charts and data sets about the levels of violent crime.
Yeah.
So I thought we should maybe start by just going through those, establish what the argument is. So first of all, you've got NHS hospital data, which shows basically a line that went up in the very late 90s and early 2000s, peaked around 2006, 2007. Around 45,000 assaults per year were reported into NHS hospitals. And that looks like it's basically been going gently down ever since. Last few years are hovering around 20,000. So by that, you would think that violent crime is down by roughly a half since its peak in the early 2000s. Is that what we think the case is?
That's what we think the case is, yes. And I'll tell you why I went for the NHS data. There was a big debate about violent crime. You might remember during the summer, Nigel Farage did this Lawless Britain campaign, where he basically was saying it's out of control, migration's a factor, etc. And this was the big summer campaign. Now, when I saw this, I thought, this is very strange because this is the opposite of the truth. But we're on a strange environment now where on social media and certain other niches of the media, you can go pretty far with a narrative without really running the risk of being corrected or coming in contact with the facts. So I did a blog on my Substack basically saying Nigel Farage says violent crime's going up. In fact, if you look at the crime survey, it's going down. Now, he responded to that by having another press conference saying Fraser Nelson talks about the crime survey. We don't believe the crime survey is right. So that's quite interesting. So you basically assert your narrative, crime is going up, mass migration is the factor, etc. And then you say, but I disbelieve the figures showing the opposite because of flaws in those figures. Now, of course, every data set has got flaws. We know that. The crime survey is pretty robust. It's got something like 30,000 households are interviewed every single year, and it's designed to be comparable. It's designed to give us 20, 30 years of data so we can look at overall trends. But of course it's got flaws.
It was brought in by Margaret Thatcher's government.
Exactly. It was brought in there for a very important reason, that most crime is unreported. That's always been the case. What she wanted to do was to find out, well, how much crime is there and what is there? So let's conduct the mother of all surveys, tens of thousands of people, asking everybody, have you been a victim of crime recently? And if so, what kind of crime? That takes in everything from sexual assault to robbery to all bicycle theft. All sorts of crime is recorded on this. Now, But if you basically say that the survey data is flawed because of flaws and, not the right people are not being consulted, it's a bit of a push, but you can still see the criticism there. So what else do you go to?
Well, just on that, let's just get a chart up. If you're watching on the YouTube, you can have a look at this, which you also put on this Substack piece that shows the annual number of crimes compared to the immigrant population. This was one of the pieces of evidence you have to counter that claim you talked about.
But this is the total number of crimes by the Crime Survey of England and Wales, and then the immigrant population, which, by the way, pretty much almost trebles there. Now, when you look at that graph, it's difficult to say that Britain is in the grip of an immigrant-driven crime wave.
I should just say, for people listening on the podcast, what we're looking at is a chart with basically two lines that go in opposite directions. The immigrant population goes up from 2000, around about 4.5 million, to north of 12 million or thereabouts in the most recent year. And surveyed crime comes down in exactly the opposite trajectory. It's almost eerie, down from around 12 million a year to more like 4 million.
It's an X shape, and it's really quite striking. Now, correlation is not causation, of course. It's not like the crime went down because the immigration went up. But what this shows is that the immigration, or rather, this isn't immigration, this is the total number of immigrants in the country, that's gone up by probably more than what most people think. And yet, the crime has gone down. So that, to me, puts to bed the idea of a migrant-driven crime wave.
We will definitely come back.
Of course, absolutely, right. But then we come back to the can you trust the crime survey? Is it all nonsense, as Nigel Farage was saying? So that's when I thought of looking up the NHS data. If you come in with a stab wound, that's recorded as being injured by a sharp object. You don't have to say I was stabbed. You don't have to report a crime. What the doctors were going to register is we're treating this patient because they've been stabbed by a sharp object, or by a blunt object, or by assault. So a whole bunch of injuries are recorded year after year by the NHS. Now, this isn't about people reporting crime or not, because we know that most crime goes unrecorded. This isn't about people answering surveys or not. These are people who are treated by the NHS. Now, that is a rather hard metric when it comes to not all violent crime, because, of course, a lot of violent crime never goes near a hospital. Most of it doesn't go near a hospital. But that which does, what is the trend that we can see? This isn't me as a journalist going over this. There is something called the Violence Research Unit at Cardiff University, a bunch of scholars who will look at every single metric. They will FOI hospital data, they will look at police data, and they conclude in their 2025 report that the trend is violent crime going down significantly, but we don't see this because we don't take notice because of the various high-profile, like atrocity we saw in the Huntingdon train. So the point is that you can search far and wide, and you will not really find any scholarly dissent from the idea that violent crime has gone down quite significantly in Britain.
And yet, if you post that on social media, which you have, you will get an almighty pushback. People will think it's almost insulting because there is such a mood that order has just degenerated, that crime is everywhere. And if you are kind of sounding Pollyanna-ish, that everything's okay, calm down, dears, I've got some charts that show you, the world's never been better. It seems to just piss people off to an extraordinary degree. Have you felt that?
Of course. I mean, this is one of the most annoying things anybody can say. There's never been a better time to be born, for example. That's an argument I would certainly make. But of course, that very quickly gets translated into saying everything is great, there is no problems. What you're really trying to say is that what's going right is outweighing what's going wrong. Now, there is lots of crime going the wrong way in Britain. We can see snatch theft surging. Here in London, the theft of expensive watches is a particular problem. We can see shoplifting really skyrocketing. People go into shops and they say, hang on a minute, here's a leg of lamb which has got a security tab on it. This, to me, looks like a country where crime is out of control. And of course you'd think that.
That's actually a really important point to just underline, which is that although violent crime, by your statistics, is reliably coming down over the longer term, the kind of casual crime that people will notice and may be more likely to be victim of, or at least know people who are victims of, such as phone snatching, witnessing shoplifting. There's other charts we could look at here, fare evasion, even dog bites, these kind of low-level crimes or acts of public disorder that give you the sense that the country's going to the dogs.
Yes,
basically.
and this is really important. We're talking here about the seen and the unseen. Now, you don't see fewer murders, you don't see fewer people getting beaten up. You only see it in the figures. But what you do see, absolutely, is shoplifting. You absolutely do see everyday items being locked up as if they're like watches. And you do see, a friend of mine was telling me that his Sainsbury's order now comes in a security sort of tag box in case anybody steals it. So when you see that, you think, God, crime is out of control.
It sort of goes against your main narrative, though, that although violent crime may be coming down, crime in the sense of petty crime, disorder, the kinds of things that make you feel unsafe is on the up.
Look, I'm saying there are certain crimes, the most conspicuous ones are on the up. But it's not just violent crime. I mean, bicycle theft is going down, burglary is going down a lot. There's a whole bunch of things. And when you basically aggregate them all together, you get quite a significant downward trend. That's what we were discussing earlier on. But this won't be seen or believed if they're visible. And by the way, let's take tube dodging. That doesn't really come up because it wouldn't come up in the crime survey. The crime survey just talks about crime against the person. I myself have suffered this crime or that crime. Shoplifting isn't included in that, for example, and nor is fare evasion. Now, what we're seeing now is a situation where I think Mary Wakefield summed this up beautifully in one of her magnificent columns of The Spectator. She wrote a few weeks ago about what it's like in Sadiq Khan's London. There she is, living in North London. And if you drive 22 miles an hour in a 20 zone, there are these 20 zones all over London, you will get busted. The cameras will catch you. You will be enforced. But, she was saying, you get the gangsters driving down the road, behaving as if the law doesn't apply to them, and that there is no real, they're not gone after. Now, this is something, so you're seeing this kind of dichotomy, the kind of hyper-policing of, shall we say, the legally compliant. The people who are given a fine are likely to pay it. And this fine goes straight to the local authority as well. They make a lot of money out of this. But we've stopped going after certain people who are difficult. Now, the fare evaders, London, I found out recently, I was near work in London Bridge, and there was a whole bunch of kids who were going through the fare gate, the gate, without paying. And there were like...
You didn't do a Robert Jenrick and
I was going to do the sort of Jenrick saying, stop there, why didn't you pay for that ticket?
You didn't?
No, I didn't know. I was just I talked to the staff and I was saying, look, have you seen this? Have you seen? So are you aware of what's going on? Now it turns out they're instructed not to chase the fare evaders. They don't like it. It kind of emasculates them in a way because they don't like people. They can see customers thinking, why aren't you stopping this? But they've basically been told it's too dangerous. Don't go after it. It's not their fault. These are orders that they're given.
So it sounds like, you would actually go along with part of the narrative that you get from people like Reform or the right of the Tory party, which is that there is a kind of disorder that needs cracking down on, the police need to do better, and there was something approaching a two-tier policing description.
It's exactly what it is, a two-tier
with what
policing
you described in North London.
It is what Mary describes. And so the two-tier is that the legally responsive are having the full weight of the law brought down upon them for a whole bunch of things. Where I live in Richmond, there is a woman who was busted for pouring coffee down a drain. She had 3 enforcement officers chasing her, telling her she was polluting what goes down the drain, and she was prosecuted. And you think this in a city where shoplifting is off the charts. That's because they go after the ones who will respond, and they're shying away from the ones who are seen as more problematic. Now that creates a perception of two-tier, of grave injustice. And
well, it is two-tier.
Well, of course it is two-tier, yeah. And with two-tier, this isn't anything to do with ethnicity or race. This is against legally responsive versus those who aren't legally responsive.
Let's talk about ethnicity and race, because actually where this gets most political and most contested is the intersection of crime data with immigration data. Yeah. There have been a few kind of studies or FOI requests or new pieces of data over the past year and a half that appear to show that certain ethnic groups, people arriving from particular countries, are much more likely to commit certain types of crimes than others. I believe Albanians came top of the league table in a recent study that took place earlier this year. This was compiled by, you might well say, a politically motivated think tank called the Centre for Migration Control, but it was based on FOI data from the Ministry of Justice.
Right. Interesting. My point is, does that think tank exist? You described it as a think tank.
Well, what is it?
A bloke.
Many think tanks are basically one bloke.
No, not really. I don't think
we can kind of, exclude small outfits from publishing statistics.
I think, I think it doesn't matter because this is a very interesting way that the media's done, right? That gets slipped out into Twitter. As far as I can work out, and forgive me if I'm doing the Centre for Migration, whatever it is, a disservice, but it was one guy who decides to rename himself the Centre for Migration Control and put things out that look like a think tank and will be taken as if they're proper research and repeated as if they are robust, where in fact it's not. It's just like a guy who might be normally anonymous on Twitter putting out stuff.
We looked into this. It caused a huge amount of interest for obvious reasons when these data points came out.
Because it says that certain groups are X times more likely to commit crime.
That's right. So the most famous claim was that an Afghan male has a 22 times more likely chance of being convicted of rape than somebody born in this country. That's a quote from Nigel Farage because he took that statistic and talked about it.
Twitter.
And that's
from the guy, yeah.
From this report. Now, that study has been criticised. You may not even call it a study. It's a data dump from the Ministry of Justice that shows the number of convictions by different crimes and allocated to different ethnicities. So the underlying data is sound, it seems to me.
I would question that.
Well, go on then. What was wrong with the original data set?
Right, there, and it is a fascinating example of here. That's what the original data set was an FOI looking for the number of people, I think it was sexual offences, over the 3-year period. Now, what I think was then done, not by the Home Office or any official organisation, was to then try to get some population estimates, which the error margin of there is absolutely huge. When you come up with a ratio, and then you would do this. Now, why is it that in the field of criminology, this sort of thing isn't done properly? Why is it that criminologists don't talk about people being X times more likely to do this, that, or the other? Now, if you've been studying this, then you would recognise this is what the AFD used to do back in the day. It was a trope, X times more likely to commit crime. But this, of course, would depend, because you would then have to look compared to the right demographic. If you're going to do a ratio, you need to look at those being found with a weapon as a ratio not of the total population, but of those likely to be out in the streets of an evening. And when you do that, the difference is nowhere near as stark.
No, the difference is not as stark, but there is still a
difference.
Significant. Well, let's just lay that out.
But the point is that Tom Calver at the Times did a similar exercise about immigrants and crime, and he was saying that if you adjust for the criminally active population, because you need to age adjust this thing, if you do that, then according to Tom Calver's calculations, the immigrants are less likely to commit crime than nationals. That was a result of his study. Now,
I mean, the criminally active population seems like a very
you need to age adjust
strange comparator.
Well, not really. If you want to look at, look at the guys who are basically done in the possession of a knife, etc., there is such a thing as age adjustment in criminology.
Age adjustment, yes. So, as I understand it, the two main complaints against that, I'm calling it a study, is first that there was a bit of a discrepancy between the date of the original conviction data and the date of the population estimate. So it's possible there are more Afghans here, well, certain there are more Afghans here than there was at the time of the 2021 census, and therefore the 22 times may be distorted. The other one is exactly the point you're making, which is age and gender. If you adjust for age and gender and adjust for the fact that many Afghan immigrants are younger and male, the ratio gets smaller still. But, for example, Sky News did exactly this exercise, and they came up with a ratio of 1 to 3. They believe it's closer to 3 times as likely that if you are an Afghan immigrant, you will be convicted for a rape conviction compared to
that's by the way,
Britain.
For the avoidance of doubt here, can I say that it's not just my belief, but the official studies, you get official studies into arrest ratios by ethnicity, and you will see there that for ethnic minorities other than whites, there's a significantly bigger ratio, and there has been for 15 years. So I'm not for a second saying that Afghans are not going to be overrepresented in these things. I'm pointing out that the methodology matters. And into this now, I don't necessarily blame this researcher who masqueraded as a think tank, because everybody's allowed to bring their point to it. If I was Nigel Farage, I would have taken my figures with a bit more credible source. But the real problem is the Home Office hasn't produced such figures, and it probably should. Now, the German government eventually realised, but they didn't like thinking of X times more likely because they thought that concept was a bit misleading. But nonetheless, eventually they did produce official figures. And if the government doesn't release, because right now, as the case here report showed, there is a scandalous lack of data of ethnicity and crime and convictions. And that, a large part of that, I suspect, is because the authorities didn't want the sort of discussion that we're having now and thought if there wasn't any data, there couldn't be that discussion. This has now started to rebound on them, and there's a lot more in speculation, a lot of it ill-informed, because the official figures have never been released.
Because I think a lot of people feel, I'm certain a lot of people feel, firstly, that there has been a decades-long sort of suppression of this as a topic of discussion, up to and including not producing proper data so that people can make accurate claims around it, like you just mentioned. And yeah, I mean, if, for example, the real number is roughly 3 times as likely for Afghan immigrants, that still is a very worrying data point that people should be able to talk about.
Sure.
Do you think that? I mean, would you rather have the whole question taken off the table, or do you think it is right and proper for people to be raising it?
No, well, not only do I think it's right and proper to raise it, but I think that there is an urgent need for the Home Office to come up with the official figures so we can all have an evidence-based discussion rather than rely on campaigners doing their own maths. Now, by the way, those campaigners are doing it. If the government won't produce figures, I think there's almost a moral duty for other people to have a best stab at this as best the data available shows. And I don't think it's possible now for the government to say that's an illegitimate debate. Your figures are wrong, but we're not going to tell you what the right ones are. You saw a little bit of this, I think, with the Huntingdon train attack. We found out pretty quickly that the nationality of the suspect and also the ethnicity of the suspect, that was told to us straight away in a way that it wasn't at Southport. So I think we can see in that a recognition by the authorities that people do want to know this information. There is a public interest in describing it.
I think what we may well get in the comments under this, which you don't absolutely need to read, are a lot of people saying that Fraser Nelson, every time there's an atrocity or there's new statistics, he comes up on my social media feed and says, calm down, Des, everything's fine. He seems to have just said that it is possible that Afghan immigrants are 3 times more likely to be convicted of rape than Britons. What does he make of that? Like, that's, whether it's 3 times or 22 times, although it's important to establish it, it's still a very worrying question. And so what should we do about that? Should that be a political question? Should we be thinking we want to be more selective about the kinds of places we take immigrants from? What are the implications of that kind of data?
First of all, you say we should be more selective from where we take them from. We're not being selective at all. Look at the small boat arrivals. A huge number of them are Afghans. Now, if you're by and large going to pay an illegal gang for passage over here, the chances of you being a law-abiding citizen are, let's say, less than they would otherwise be. So I think that what's happening right now is, yes, we are seeing mass criminality on a daily basis, tens of thousands of people. Now, what I would advocate is that every single one of those boat arrivals is deported and sent somewhere like Rwanda. If Rwanda can't do it, then we're somewhere in Bosnia, etc. So I would argue for that to happen immediately. I thought the Conservatives were right to do that. Well, people are, and this is the thing, I am arguing for nuance in this debate, which is very difficult to do when times are polarised. Because you're quite right. When I come up with nuance and I say, look, Nigel Farage says violent crime is soaring, in fact it's not. Now that is not quite the same as me saying there's nothing to worry about, there is no crime in this country, immigrant-driven crime doesn't exist. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that these things are very, very important subjects that we need to discuss carefully and with the data. Now, my own personal view would be for, ideally, on the day of arrival, for the small boat arrivals to be deported to some third-party place and never have the option of coming to the UK. That might strike some people as too harsh. But then again, I would also say that for every single person we deport, we should take, say, 2 or 3 vetted people from the camps. We've got many refugee camps right now, many people with a good claim wanting to come to Britain, many people we've vetted as being appropriate. Now, I would do that because, here's another controversial opinion of mine, I believe that we have a moral duty as a rich country to the rest of the world. Now, just how we discharge that is up for debate, but that duty is there. And that duty involves, of course, foreign aid. That duty involves helping displaced people, and on occasion it will involve relocating people as well. So I think that there is a new consensus to be struck here. Nobody likes the mass illegality that we're seeing with a small boat arrival. When you look at the Epping Hotel situation, it was just, in every single way it showed our system being absolutely broken. And that leads more people to think, of course there is bedlam, etc. And then you will get people then taking it to extremes. The country's finished, the country's in a grip of violent crime, the streets aren't safe, London has fallen, etc. I go along with some of the argument, but not all of it. And I come over this not as a conservative or a leftist or anything like that, but simply as a journalist whose job, by and large, our journalist's job is to try to inject that perspective, to try and put in the facts that may grate against the overall narrative, even if we get, as you put it, slated in the comments.
This idea of the moral duty to the rest of the world, it feels incredibly unfashionable, I would say, almost out of time. It feels like I haven't heard any politician talk about that since the Cameroon years, almost. It's like a sort of decades old.
Yeah, that's a great advantage of not being a politician. I completely agree with you,
but normally people...
It's one of these things, if you say that, everybody will hate you.
Well, they will. The first thing
below.
I think people will say, and I think it's a good counter, is surely the primary moral duty of a government is to its own citizens before it starts helping people from Afghanistan or
of course,
Eritrea.
Absolutely. Again,
and we have our own poverty to deal with. We have an economy that isn't working. We have people living in very difficult circumstances. Once we've sorted out our own, we can worry about everyone else. What do you say to those people?
That is not either or. Absolutely, the primary duty of a government is to its own citizens. That's so obvious it need not be said. I also think that we're giving away far too much on foreign aid, given our own failure to balance the books and our own failure to meet our demands to our own people. But I don't think that if you think our main priority is number one, that we then cut to zero foreign aid, or we cut to zero the number of refugees which we take into the country, is just a question of balance. But right now, more is a question of fairness. Now, I think the consensus in Britain, we've always been a globally minded country, a country that wants to shape the world rather than be shaped by it, a country that does. Look at the response to the Ukrainian crisis. We had family after family opening their house to the refugees, as we did in most of Western Europe. That's the kind of country that we are. But similarly, when we see the people smuggling gangs driving a coach and horses through anything that might be seen to be basic laws and protection, that really undermines faith, not just in the system, but it will drive people to think that the country's falling apart, because this is very visible. It's an incredibly, with a daily drumbeat of small boat arrivals, it suggests a system which is out of control, because that particular system is out of control. My point is that it doesn't follow that our streets are also out of control. We don't need to take back control of the streets because we've already got them in control.
You talk about the consensus position. It does feel, doesn't it, that there has been a very rapid hardening in public opinion on the issue of immigration. I mean, there was a piece just a few days ago looking at how some of our voters are now more hardline on immigration than American Republicans. And you talk quite a lot about what's going on social networks like Twitter, where people are overtly now talking about policies like remigration, about the idea that not only new arrivals, but children of immigrants should be treated as somehow not British. I mean, we had most recently Matt Goodwin, who's someone I know you have sparred with on occasion on Twitter, who responded to this train atrocity that you mentioned by putting British in double quote marks around the suspect, who is called Anthony Williams and was born in Britain, but who is black and who is the son of two immigrants. What is your view on that? Is it a hardening, or is that just a kind of social media concoction?
I think, look, it's certainly, we've seen the sort of destruction of the Overton window, as it were. And so a whole bunch of things that would be seen to be unsayable before are being said now. Now, we can also see that this is having interesting results. Take the row in America right now over Tucker Carlson and his interview guest, So I guess people are thinking, okay, where do we draw the line? Now, when it comes, actually here, I don't have a problem with Matt Goodwin's definition here. He is basically saying, in his blog that he did, he was listing a whole bunch of attacks over people who were the children of immigrants.
I've got it here. Let me just quote it. This is part of the argument as made by a guy called Garrett Jones in a book called The Culture Transplant, which is that when a nation imports people, it imports the average cultural traits of those people. That's something Matt Goodwin is talking about at the moment. Quote, the 2025 Manchester synagogue terrorist, Syrian parents. The 2024 Southport terrorist, Rwandan parents. The 2021 Liverpool terrorist, born in Iraq. The 2021 terrorist who murdered Sir David Amis, parents from Somalia. The 2020 Reading terrorist, born in Libya. The 2020 Streatham terrorist, parents from Sri Lanka. The 2019 Usman Khan terrorist, parents from Afghanistan, and so on. The list goes on. Is that flawed logic? Is it a reasonable question to ask that are we importing more violent cultures by having so many people come from cultures that are provably more violent than us?
Well, that was a list of Islamic terrorists, and I think it's no great surprise that your average Islamist tends not to be sort of sixth-generation English. I think I'm not quite sure how many people think of it differently. We had Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Apart from that, not very many. I think there's a more substantive point that Matt Goodwin is trying to make here. That you and I, Freddie, we both know Sweden very well. We both know that in Sweden there is a phrase for this: foreign background. Foreign background. I mean, in Sweden it's almost uncontroversial to use the word immigrant to apply to the children of immigrants. Rishi Sunak would be described as an immigrant in the Swedish dialogue, or certainly somebody with a foreign background. And that is a kind of label which they apply to that. Now, to Brits, it's bizarre, even appalling to suggest that Rishi Sunak is anything less than British. Although recently his Englishness has come under question due to the growing number of, a certain movement who think that that you cannot be of non-white skin and being English. But that notion of foreign background, I think, is valid, and I don't think it's a racist one. It's just a lens through looking at society. So again, I think that Matt Goodwin is perfectly entitled to apply all the analytical tools he wants to our current situation. I think we're all...
But you mentioned Sweden. This is a country we both know well. It's almost so obvious that it doesn't need any statistics to prove it, although there are plenty, that the mass immigration experiment in Sweden of the past 15 or so years has resulted in massively more violence in that country. It was not an especially violent country before. There are now these enclaves where there is gang violence really to a much higher degree. Would you dispute that as well?
I would, yes. And I would say it's worse than that. If you actually look at who is doing the gang violence, the disgusting phenomenon of the so-called child soldiers, where kids at the age of 12, 13 are being recruited into gangs, they are people who are born in Sweden. This is an integration problem Sweden have got, not an immigration problem. The guys who are being fought and arrested and prosecuted for the gangland crimes, the bulk of them were born in Sweden. They speak certain, Huseby svensk, sort of patois. I would say the problem of integration is, if anything, worse. But we're not really talking about the recent arrival. So my point is, yes, this raises huge, big questions. But if you could say, yeah, we let in some criminal guys 10 years ago and now they're committing crimes, in a way, that's not quite as bad as thinking that people who were born in this country, who had every opportunity in this country, are still now turning to gangland crime. That suggests something systemic and a problem of integration. And you can see this right around Europe.
Or does it suggest that they are importing some of the culture that they learned from their parents?
Well, that
is what Matt is saying, and that's what a lot of people online would say, that there can't be this taboo about talking about anyone who was born in Britain suddenly must be, they are British in all respects. If you can look at trends that suggest, like you're talking about in Sweden, that they're actually continuing some kind of culture of violence that their parents brought with them. I mean, that's the accusation. Is it outrageous to make it?
No, to be honest, it's not. I wouldn't really say that's the accusation, because the Swedish situation is seen from a distance as being an immigrant relation rather than integration. And I was actually speaking to a policeman in Sweden about this a few months ago. He himself was Afghan, and he was saying that there are waves of Afghan immigration. My wave settled down pretty well, other waves have not. To your point, he was saying it's not as if these guys' parents were criminally inclined. They weren't on the rampage. This is what happens if you put people into these estates like Rickeby, Huseby and Rosenbad and Malmo, And they're segregated estates. They're not really policed. They're left to be a country within a country that the arm of the law struggles to penetrate. That is what you get there by an integration failure. When you look at the immigration patterns that Sweden has had, we can see similar patterns, for example, in Germany, in other countries, and they have nothing like Sweden's child gang problem. Now, if you want to find a Swedish difference, it's probably the fact that there was more, according to my Afghan policeman, he was saying the problem is that in continental Europe, you do have organised gang crimes who do not allow other gangs to enter into the area, and they don't allow the kind of casual execution which a lot of these child soldiers have been doing in Sweden. And that was why Sweden is now, I think, the second in Europe for gun offences.
But the argument on the online right, and increasingly on the mainstream right, is when you look at Sweden, that's what we don't want to become. And actually the error that Sweden made, they will say, is not just that they were inadequately good at integrating people from different backgrounds, is that they should never have let them in the first place. It's very hard to believe that Sweden would have the highest gun murder rate in the EU, 30 times that of London in Stockholm, 32 gang-related bombings in January 2025 alone. It's impossible, actually, to think, is it not, that those kind of statistics would be true if none of that immigration had happened over recent multiple decades.
Right, but if immigration was the original sin, then why don't we see that in any of the other many European capitals that we're in? It is simply more complicated than that. And also, until fairly recently, Sweden had a pretty good record of absorbing refugees. My own wife's parents were refugees to Sweden. That's how I came to know the country. And so they basically had such good results, but they kept going until they took in more than they could handle. And they did this with a big problem, that Sweden has always had a massive employment gap between the natives and between the immigrants. In other words, that was a massive integration problem. And into that, they just piled a huge per capita number of immigrants with pretty bad results. Now, Britain has had a different experience. We don't have the employment gap. When it comes to integration, we have more of a success than most of the rest of Europe. And when you actually look overall, see, this is another, if you want to list Fraser's deeply unfashionable opinions, one of my unfashionable opinions here is that Britain has got quite a lot to boast about when it comes to successes. Now, I tell you when this really hit home for me, I was watching the King's coronation, and a friend of mine was over from America, and we're just watching it on TV. And, it's a beautiful service, of course, everybody loves it. And he pointed out something to me that I'd never really thought. That we had a church reading by Rishi Sunak, a Hindu, with his Indian wife, with security arranged by a Buddhist Home Secretary, Swala Braverman, with a mayor of London, a Muslim, Sadiq Khan, in attendance, the First Minister of Scotland, also a Muslim, in attendance, and the chief rabbi who'd been there because he'd walked from Buckingham Palace as a guest of the king the night before so he wouldn't break the Sabbath. My friend said no other country in the world could such a scene be imaginable, and yet we don't even think it's remarkable. That this is the funny thing, and Rishi Sunak said this quite himself, that Britain is perhaps the most successful multi-faith democracy in the world, precisely because it isn't controversial. Nobody cared that Sunak worked with a Ganesh idol on his desk, that he and his kids would do Hindu worship at number 10. Nobody cares about that.
People seem to care a lot more than they did. I mean,
that was just 3 years ago, though.
Well, I know, but it feels like things have changed already in those 3 years.
I'm not so sure. I think this is, look, the social media debate has changed.
Alongside wonderful scenes like the King's coronation, there has been a lot of talk of grooming gangs. That's become a huge, I think, right to focus on that and uncover the truth of it. There have been a number of attacks. There is uncertainty. I mean, it's not all, Westminster Cathedral and crowned heads of Europe celebrating and singing Kumbaya. In poorer parts of our country, integration is less successful.
And I'm not denying that for a second. You see, this is, again, if you don't mind me saying so, is part of the problem of a debate. The moment that you point to a success, somebody says, oh, it's not all like that, there's lots of failures. Yes, there are. And we hear quite a lot about these failures, and they're serious failures, and we need to address them. But there are also successes which it seems dare not mention their name now, because it interferes with the mono-narrative of Britain being a country ruined by mass immigration and going down the Kazi very fast. Now, I think it ought to be possible to mention both things, to mention the successes and the failures, to work out where integration succeeds and the ways in which Britain, as what I've just described to you there, certainly to the eyes of foreigners, is a kind of multi-faith success imaginable in no other country in the world, as well as admitting that we've got huge problems. We had, for example, in Dundee a few weeks ago, an Albanian grooming gang was brought to justice. Now, that is something which is, obviously this isn't Asian, but it's just many faces of the same evil. But these are huge, absolutely huge problems happening all the time. My point is that these problems don't define our country. And going back to my original point, that when you want to find out overall, do individual acts of violence mean that we're getting a bit more violent country? There are many ways of looking at the facts to try to answer that question. And then trying, even though nobody will thank you and everybody will hate you for pointing it out, that overall what we're getting right outweighs what we're getting wrong.
So in sum, what do you think the political solution to this is? Because it feels like, even with all your charts and all the data sets and all of the good news stories that you're carrying with you,
I just call them facts.
They are not landing in with the voters, I guess. You're not a politician, you're not asking for any votes, but it does feel like if mainstream politicians were now going to sort of adopt the Fraser Nelson handbook and just start telling everyone how actually we're a success story and everything's much better than you read about on Twitter, and and drumming home that argument, it doesn't feel like people would respond very well. Or is that what you think they should do?
No, of course not. It's not politicians' job to say how wonderful everything is. They're not commentators. They are put in power to solve problems. They should be talking non-stop about what's going wrong and what they can do about it.
So what should they do about it? Are you someone who thinks immigration needs to come drastically down? Would you like to see a period of net zero immigration, even if just to settle the politics of the country and remove a lot of the claim of some of these elements that you're talking about? What would you like to see happen?
I would. I'd like to see more than net zero immigration. I'd like to see some net negative immigration for a while. I think when you look at what happened during the Boris Johnson era, that was way out of control. So I think it's quite plausible for Britain to do what Sweden has recently done, which is to not just achieve net zero, but to achieve net negative. I think that's for a whole bunch of reasons. But mainly, I think, to try to restore public confidence in the borders, which the Conservatives completely squandered. They took back power to control the borders, complete power, and then lost that and got booted out as a result.
How would they get to net zero? And do you think the Labour government can do it before the next election?
Yeah, absolutely.
How?
I rather hope that Shabana Mahmood does do this. Oh, well, right now, to get to net zero, to state the obvious, you need fewer coming in than going out. When you look at how many are going out right now, it's about 400,000 a year, the most ever. And that's foreign nationals, by the way. The number of Brits leaving, despite what everybody says about Britain, is really a multi-decade low. So all you need to do is to get income less than 400,000 and you will get net zero.
Because the forecasts for 26, 27 are much down from the highs of nearly 1 million, but they're in the kind of 250 to 300,000.
That's what the OBR says right now. Of course, as the OBR has shown the world, it's very difficult to accurately project this. And what Sweden actually showed was that immigration usually unwinds itself after a few years. Only a minority of people come to a country, stay there forever. Most will stay for a few years and go back. So partly because Sweden had so many coming in a few years ago, it's got quite a lot leaving right now. It wouldn't surprise me if Britain's outflow is bigger than we previously expected. But of course, the inflow is a tap we can control any time. The government lost a battle of nerves with people like care home owners, for example, saying that we demand a right to have immigrants and pay them less than shelf stackers. Now, we should have said, no, forget it. You pay people properly. Your business model, which is low immigration, high immigration and low wages, that doesn't work anymore. We want you to pay people skilled wages for a skilled job. And that didn't happen. So again, in saying things to you that I would like, net zero, even net negative migration, I'm probably in a minority.
You heard it here first. Fraser Nelson, hardliner, immigration hardliner.
I'm used to being
terrifying right-winger.
I'm used to being called all sorts of things. But the funny thing about journalism is that you don't really play to the gallery. If you do, it's not journalism. You've just got to call it how you see it. And even if that means that you're going to get dog's abuse for so doing, then you do it. I mean, that's the, that's the name of the game.
Ethno-nationalism. Do you think that is a real danger Do you think it has come back because of this collection of circumstances and the kind of narratives around it? Do you worry that we are actually entering a period of genuine ethno-nationalism?
I think the re-racialization of society has been happening for quite some time. It's strange because I was brought up at a time where there was racism. People with non-white skin were told to go home, to use phrases that some politicians are now using, and we all knew what that meant. It was racism, it was vile, it was systemic, but it felt as if we were winning the war over that, and we were getting to a place where we were finally able to, as Martin Luther King put it, judge people by the content of the character, not the colour of their skin. Now, I think this changed with the left, first of all. I think the re-racialisation happened when critical race theory came along and people started to be seen as skin colours first and then persons second. I was very much against that for the same reason that I've always hated racial politics. And now we're basically, so that was what you might call the woke left. And now we're seeing the equivalent of a woke right doing the same. Saying that Rishi Sunak can't possibly be English because look at the colour of his skin. It doesn't matter if the guy's family's been here for 3 generations. Doesn't matter if he's cricket mad and a Winchester head boy. You couldn't get more English than Rishi Sunak in my view. But nonetheless, you do see this as an argument now. I am opposed to racial politics. To say you're opposed to racism ought not to be controversial.
What about cultural, not racial? Because I think what a lot of those people who you appear not to like would say at this point is, it's not about skin colour. They may be very well disposed to African Christians, for example. It's about they are sceptical about the degrees to which Muslims are properly integrating, and they're worried about these cultural imports, that's one of which may or may not be bearing out in these figures. That's what they would say. It's not the skin colour, it's the cultures that we don't want to import into our midst.
And I would very much agree that multiculturalism is a mistake. We should have one homogenising British culture open to people of all faiths and all colours. And that, I think, is how countries muddle along together. I'm not saying I want everybody in this country to be the same. Of course you don't. You give me any ethnicity and you have people living their life in different cultural ways. But broadly speaking, there ought to be certain values to which everybody ought to subscribe for a good society.
So would it be okay if the data supports it to be more cautious about immigration from certain cultures around the world that the data suggests integrate less well than others?
Well, again, I would question how big that data is. I mean, if you take the notion of culturally compatible, for example, and you kind of wonder what that means, and what I was thinking about was Sajid Javid's mum. You know, she came in here illiterate, kind of penniless, Muslim woman, and yet what did she bring into this country? A former Home Secretary, but also Baz Javid is a commander of the Metropolitan Police, went on to be, right now he's running the deportation unit.
That's Sajid Javid's brother?
Yes, Baz Javid, yeah. And then you had another high-flying accountant. My point is, she did a fairly heroic job, this woman, bringing in abject poverty, bringing up a family, I would say all of whom are positive contributions to this society. And yet you can see if you want to apply a little test, like, is somebody culturally compatible? This is where I just get uneasy. I don't think any kind of test can be applied to a human being to work out, do you fit or do you not? Britain is a country which cherishes eccentricity, which cherishes difference and allows people to be different. I think we've always been that way. The general public of this country is overwhelmingly tolerant, kind, understanding. I don't think, to ask your question, how worried am I don't think Britain is ever going to go down a racist route. I think the people who do want to promote race-baiting politics have now got digital avenues to pursue that which they didn't used to have. And this is a free country and they're richly entitled to avail themselves of that freedom. But the health of this country, I am pretty confident about. And if you want to know if a country is in deep trouble or not, then look at the working age population projections. Italy is going to lose 5 million, that's a projection. I think Germany is something like 3 million, France is 3 million. There's only 2 countries in Europe that are expected to have an increase in working age population.
Through immigration.
Britain and Sweden. No, it depends. Right now, a third of kids born in this country are born to an immigrant mother. So, you take away the immigrant mothers, you'll see a decline in working line. But my point is that when you look at the countries who are in the grip of depopulation, like Japan is, for example, they're talking about an existential crisis. They cannot see a way of reversing this. No, people like South Korea, they spent billions of dollars trying to reverse the low birth rates, trying to get the working age population going up. Nothing seems to work. So if you want to bet on a country's success over the next decade, if you're, say, a teenager working out what country to go and study in to make your life in, I think you would see in Britain a country which has got huge problems, absolutely, but broadly speaking is able to handle demographic change better than almost anybody else, and a country which fundamentally is growing, and a country, which is, as we started off a discussion saying, has got streets that have been safer than any time in my lifetime, perhaps that. And there is so much more to do. Any crime is too much crime. And the other thing is, I do not for a second think people are wrong to point all the time to things that are going wrong. That's how we evolve as a species. We don't congratulate ourselves for the fantastic progress we've made. We look at the next problem to vanquish. We get very upset about it. We don't stop until it's solved. That's the British way. And we're going to keep doing this, keep focusing on the problems. All I'm saying is that now and again, it doesn't hurt so much to see the progress we've made, to put things in perspective, and to realise that to have an energy of reform, you can be fuelled by rational optimism because of what we've achieved previously already. Now, in that knowledge, you should be all the more determined, all the more energetic, and all the more confident about achieving even more in the years to come.
Fraser, thank you for coming into UnHerd.
Great to be here.
That was Fraser Nelson. I was going to say friend of the show, but he's actually never been on UnHerd before. Former Spectator editor, now star columnist at The Times, talking there very broadly about his views on crime data and immigration. Whatever you made of it, let us know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.